Okay, so here in chapter 4.4, complex numbers, we have thus far evaluated expressions with square roots of negative numbers, and we have also looked at products of, or evaluated expressions involving products of pure imaginary numbers. And now we're going to go here to page 247, and this is example 3, and we're looking at equations with pure imaginary solutions. Isn't it fun thinking about imaginary numbers? So we know we're going to have an equation, and we're going to end up with an imaginary number. So let's look at this one. This is guided practice 3A, where we got 4x squared plus 100 equals 0. And we're going to be solving for x. So our first task is we're going to subtract 100 from both sides. And when we do, we're going to have 4x squared equals negative 100. Well, we got a 4x squared, so if we're proceeding to try to isolate the x, we're going to divide both sides by 4. That's going to give us x squared equals negative 25. And of course, we've got x squared, so if we're going to isolate the x, we got to take the square root of both sides. And I'm going to go ahead and write it like this. Most of the time, I'd skip this step, or as far as taking the square root of x squared. So I got square root of x squared now equals the square root of negative 25. Remember, if I do something to one side of an equation and also do it to the other, that is a permissible mathematical move. And then this leaves me with x equals the square root of negative 25. Now, I'm going to break this down to its component parts. I'm about to run out of room here because I want to do 2 of these on this. And let me put right here, well, not yet. Okay, yeah, I am. Plus or minus. This is actually plus or minus the square root of negative 25. Now, if I'm looking at the square root of negative 25, I can break that down into square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 25, excuse me, times the square root of 25. And I know from what we've previously learned that the square root of negative 1 is I, and I can also determine that the square root of 25, well, 25 is a perfect square, that's 5 times 5. So x is going to equal plus or minus 5i. All right, not too bad. Let's look at one more. Let's look at guided practice 1b, where we have an equation, x squared plus 4 equals 0. So we're going to subtract 4 from both sides. It's going to give us x squared is equal to negative 4. And then I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and when I do, I'm going to have x equals the square root of negative 4. Well, square root, and it's plus or minus. Don't forget that, plus or minus. All right, so if I break this down into its component parts, this is equal to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4. And I know that the square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 4 is 2, and so x is going to equal plus or minus 2i. Okay, there we go. Equations with pure imaginary solutions.